That's me. Okay, welcome back. All right, so it is obviously Wednesday, of the second week of the course. Okay, so a couple of things, I guess, important on the agenda for today. And actually, maybe I'll create a quick slide so I can write some stuff here. Just need a blank slide right here. Okay. Yeah, so just a couple of really quick things before I kind of get started on course material. Okay, so obviously, midterm number one, if you don't know, midterm number one is next Wednesday, right? So that is Wednesday, May 20th. The way I do the midterms in courses like these, again, because I know it's spring and I know we want to provide people with flexibility and become, in a large part because the room they've given us here, having you come in and write things on your laptops usually leads to laptops falling over because these desks are tiny and it's open book, right? So I want you to have access to other notes and devices. Oh, maybe I'll write open book. You do it from wherever you want, right? So it's open book. You get 90 minutes. And basically it's going to be open from 0:00, right? So midnight to 23:59 hours. And I use the 24-hour clock just so that there's no confusion about what, when the exam is open. Okay. It is 5 short answer questions. And each of those questions is worth 10 marks. And I'll show you some examples. After we finish, we have one unit we're going to talk about today. After I'm done that, we'll take a break, and then we will come back and talk a little bit about the midterm. But I think the questions, for the most part, are pretty straightforward. It will require a little bit of information from the course to answer them, right? But again, I'll get into that a little bit later. Okay, so the 3 units, right? So there's going to be 3 units on the exam. And I think the syllabus says, that we would cover families. And I was looking at it, and the families unit is pretty long, right? It's about as long as the generations one. I'll probably go through it before next week and sort of try to pare it down a little bit. But we're going to look at kind of, history of youth and childhood. Youth and childhood, right? So that's, the postman stuff. We're going to look at, generate all the generation stuff, which again is kind of history. And then we're going to look at education, right? So there's going to be education. And basically the way I have it structured is you'll get 2 questions from here, 2 questions from here, and 1 question from education. because it's by far of the three the shortest of the units. Okay, so that is the exam. Now, so obviously there's no class on Monday, right? Monday the 18th is Victoria Day. So there's no class, right? Because it's May long weekend. So don't come. I won't be here. The buildings are locked. There's no online stream either, right? There's just no class on Monday. So you get a little, you get a little bit less lecture time in a Monday, Wednesday spring course than you would in a Tuesday, Thursday one. If it was a Tuesday, Thursday one, we could probably cover families, but it's not. So, we are where we are. So no class on Monday. On Wednesday, we'll start class at the normal time, right? So we will start class at 1, right? Or 1300, if you want that. But we'll only go for an hour and a half, right? So we will go to, basically 1430 hour, until 2:30 or 1430, right? Depending on, again, which notation you prefer, right? And then that time, the remainder of the class time you can use to write the exam if you want. You can stay here. You can find another place on campus. I'll stick around for probably till the end of our normal class time before heading home, and I'll be in my office if you need to come and ask me any questions before the exam and all of that fun stuff. Some people will already have written it. Other people won't have, but you have the whole day. But we'll only do an hour and a half class, so it's not like stacking extra time on top of the normal class time. So just to give you a little bit more flexibility. Okay, but I will say one thing. The content from the class on Wednesday won't be on the test, right? So we're going to start families on Wednesday at our normal time, but that material is not included on the first midterm. That material is going to get kicked over to midterm number 2. Okay, any questions before I know it's like a long 10-minute preamble before getting into things, but any questions before I jump in? And you can think about them because, like I said, we're going to look over some practice midterm questions before I let you go today. But if there are no questions, nothing. Okay, I've probably been overly clear. All right. Well, I guess if there's no questions, let's jump into it. Yeah, please.
What about people with like accommodation?
Oh, yeah. So your time multiplier, I haven't put them in yet, but that is among my tasks for tomorrow is to put in everybody's accommodations. So whatever, if you have, say, a 1.5 times accommodation, it would be 90 minutes times 1.5, right? I don't think anyone in this class has some of the more complex accommodations, like with audio readers or anything, but those all work because there's no proctoring software, so everything works just fine. So yeah, that's a good question. But yeah, I put them in and then they're there for all of your exams. I just haven't gotten there yet. Is it Seth? Is your name Seth? Okay, I remember you. And your mom, you took my SOC 100 class at the same time, right? Okay, good. I'm like, I know you, but what is your name? And it came to me. Okay, good stuff. Any other questions about the exam? Was that a half-hearted, I think, maybe I have a question and then a withdrawal? Okay. It's like, no. Okay, sometimes people do that. All good. Okay, well, if nothing, oh yeah, please. They're not showing, interesting. Why are they not showing up? Okay, let me see what is going on. Are these the questions that are on Slido? Okay, let's see if they load now. Aha! Technology. It's a mystery. What's the tea of the day? Wild Sweet Orange. Tazo Wild Sweet Orange. One of my favorites. And what do people with accommodations do? Yeah, just find you don't have to go to the accommodations office to write or anything like that. There's no need to do any of those things. You just write as normal, and yeah, your accommodation will be, will be added on. If you have accommodations for extra time, yes, I'll add it all on to Canvas. Like I said, probably tomorrow, because I have to go. I did some of them about a week ago, but I didn't finish. So I have to go through and make sure everybody has their accommodations. But yeah, I will go through and make sure that your time multipliers are all applied, and on Canvas. Yeah, it'll, everybody else gets 90 minutes. You'll get 90 minutes times whatever your accommodation is. And it works pretty seamlessly, assuming Canvas hasn't been more broken. What's the figurative T of the day? An intriguing and metaphysical question that I must go off and ponder. Let me see. What's going on in the world today? So what would be the figurative T of the day? I mean, global trade is still an issue, but it's mostly oil rather than tea. So maybe we're talking just a straight, like, Earl Grey tea, that thing that the British sought after for so many years, and went around the world conquering half the globe to secure their supply of tea. So Earl Grey tea is the figurative tea of the day, but wild sweet orange is the actual tea in my tumbler. And if when we take a break, I'll probably go refill it, and I will make. Can we email you questions of the midterm? Wait, what's the wait time? That's a good question. Yeah, okay. So I'll put it to you like this, because I think that's a fair question. If you have questions about the midterm, and if you're concerned about this, maybe I'll write the answer to this down. The best time for this is going to be basically from 9 till 1400, right, when the class starts. From 1400, and there I'll have my email open. So you're probably looking at somewhere between a 5 to 10 minute kind of response time, because I'll just have it open on one of my monitors, right, snapped onto the one side. So I see when new emails roll in, and I have my notifications on my phone turned on, so I usually get the emails really quickly. Obviously, because I'll be teaching, right, from 1400 to, 1300. That should be 1300. 1300, I'm good with the 24-hour clock. 1 and 2, I always get mixed up. I always want to say 1 o'clock is 1400, but it's 1300. So let's fix that. Okay, so 1300 to 1430, right? I would say you're looking at probably a 1.5 hour response time at best. 1431 to what time do we end? That'll be basically 1600 or 4 o'clock, right? Again, you'll be looking at probably a 5 to 10 minute response time. After which I go home. So, after 1600, big question mark. That one's going to lag a little bit more, because after that point, I'm in, by 5:20, I've taken my son. 16:00 I have to drive home so I can pick up my son to take him to Taekwondo. At Taekwondo, I probably will be looking at my phone, because sitting there is kind of boring. Watching him practice the same patterns, pumses and jushimsigis over and over again is a little on the duller side. So I could probably answer relatively quickly. But once I get home, right, so like 1800, and after, again, it's going to be probably a little bit laggier, just because lots of family stuff going on, my youngest to put to bed, and dinner to cook and all of those things. And I'm old and incredibly, incredibly boring. So like after 2100, probably next day. and this is way more detail than you wanted, but I'm telling you, because I think you want to, if you're worried, you probably want to aim to do your exam kind of here or in this sweet spot, right? Yeah, after 2100, I'm probably in bed because I get up at like 5:30 in the morning. So I go to bed pretty early as well. So you might be waiting for a long time and it might not be relevant at that point. It's like, what do you mean by this on this question? It's like, well, what I did mean, but you've submitted the exam by then, right? So yeah, and I mean, even before 9 o'clock, it'll probably be pretty quick. Like I said, I'm up at 5:30 in the morning. I'm not looking at my phone through much of the morning, but I'll try to keep an eye on it. Now I've given you the details of my entire Wednesday schedule. But yeah, like I said, you're probably best to aim to do the exam if you're worried about it in that 9 to 1 o'clock zone, or 2:30 to 4, roughly speaking. Bless you. I missed your sneeze because I was talking. Okay. So that now you know my entire schedule. It's up on YouTube, so if someone wants to stalk me, they'll know exactly where to go. Not that anyone would bother. I'm simply not that interesting. Okay, any other questions before I jump into material for today? And thank you for, I'm always a little worried with a short unit that it's going to go by too fast. I'm going to let you guys go like an hour and a half early, and then I'll feel slightly bad about it. So now we've burned off 20 minutes, so that's wonderful. We'll burn off some more later. Not that that was my intent. Okay, let's talk education. So very quickly, I'm going to go back. You know what? Let's clear this off, and we'll talk a little bit about what we talked about last time, just to kind of give you a very, very quick, catching up. So we talked about, essentially 3 generations last time. Millennials, Gen Z, and Gen Alpha. Key points on millennials. So we talked about, I guess values and moral reasoning. And kind of key points, right? Millennials are consequentialists. Moral consequentialists when it comes to their values, right? There's no objective morality, right? Because they're postmodernistic and they're relativistic. And they judge morality on its consequences, most specifically on whether it harms other people, right? So the idea that millennials have is do no harm. They can't really justify that moral assumption, but it is the moral assumption that they have. Their values around things like, LGBT rights, racial equality, and all those things are quite on the progressive side compared to older generations. I'm trying to think what are in those last couple of slides. They're not, or at least when they were young, they weren't particularly engaged in, the big ethical debates that were going on at the time. And in terms of technologies, right, that really affected them, right, would be the internet and social media. Bless you. Okay. All right. And yeah, I guess the other thing we talked about last time, marriage and relationships are for later. All those old dating scripts and life scripts that say were very clear for, the silents, right? And the baby boomers, right, who had a very clear idea of how you lived your life, right? If you're a baby boomer, you go to school, either high school or college, you get a job, you get married, you have kids in a relatively short order, and that's sort of the way it goes, right? We see some of that getting scrambled with Gen X, and by the time we reach Gen Z, it's completely scrambled. So we get all this fun new vocabulary trying to describe what millennial relationships look like, friends with benefits. There's some weird ones that millennials came up with. Living together apart, which was when you lived at someone's place some of the time, and you kept a lot of your stuff there, but you weren't actually living together. So all sorts of weird, vocabulary. And obviously we joked around some of the Gen Z innovations around things like situationships, right? But the big idea for millennials, relationships are for later. Once you've got your career, your housing, your finances in order, then you look at getting married, And again, we'll talk about that more later in the course. Okay, Gen Z, what do we kind of say as a review for Gen Z? Growing up pretty slowly, right, compared to millennials and Gen X in particular. Long childhood, relatively short adolescence. Less likely to hit some of those markers of emerging adulthood, like having a job, dating, driving. There's other things, but I can't remember them off the top of my head. They'll hit those later than the two generations that preceded them, right? They're more homebodies, right? They're safer, but it's a lot related to the fact that they don't go out as much. Pretty open on gender, right? So when it comes to gender and kind of gender experimentation and terminology, generally, pretty open to different identities and possibilities, and big surges, in transgender, non-binary, and other kind of marginalized identities, particularly bisexuality, especially amongst those assigned female at birth, right? So lots going on there, and facing a big anxiety crisis, right? There's a lot of tough stuff going on with Gen Z in terms of mental health, which again, we will dig into as we go forward. I wrote so much for millennials, and I wrote one thing for Gen Z. Are we the or Generation Me, the narcissists? As Jean Twenge said, maybe. Okay. All right, Gen Alpha, right? Obviously, this is our youngest part of the cohort. We only have a little bit of data on them. Born 2011 through we don't know when, but probably right about now, 2025, 2026, as a sort of end date for Gen Alpha. Again, they're just coming into the data, so it's pretty preliminary, but they're really racially diverse, right? And their friendships are pretty diverse, which matches the demographics, right? More religious and spiritual than you might think, right? Spirituality and religion are still the sort of dominant frames, and most of them say they're either religious or spiritual or both, by a wide margin. The religious identities mirror the overall population at about 2/3, saying that they are Christian. About half of those who say they're Christian are just Christian, pointing to deinstitutionalization. If you ever thought I need the slides to do this course, I could basically do this whole course out of my head, more or less. Not quite, but if you ever thought I'm just reading off the slides are all inside my brain somewhere. What else is interesting about them? So racially diverse. They use phones a lot, right? So phones and phone addiction is a pretty common kind of framing for them, right? And almost all of them have phones, or have access to phones, have access to computers, and have access to tablets and video game consoles. Fewer of them have access to virtual reality headsets, but those are lame anyway. I don't know, maybe I just haven't used a good one. Trying to think what else. Their anxiety levels seem a little bit lower than Gen Z, and they seem to be, at least initially, in this first bit of data, a little bit more risk tolerant than their slightly older Gen Z peers. Okay, and that, I believe, is basically where we left things off. So with that very quick review, let's now talk about education. Okay, obviously when we're talking about youth, education is sort of paramount. And why? Well, because school and education is going to be the primary occupation of most young people, right? Children, adolescents, and emerging adults, for a good chunk of this time, you're going to be in school, right? And you think, the average person will start probably pre-K, maybe at about 4. We got our pre-K. By 5, you're in kindergarten. You can tell I'm married to a teacher. They just say kinder. They don't even bother to finish the word. It's just funny, I guess, if you're coming from German, because it's just like children. Kinder is just like children. Kindergarten, right? Well, the garden of children. but it's just just children. That's all it is in kindergarten. All right, so kindergarten, right? And basically from 6 to between, sorry, tripping over my own tongue. So between 6 and roughly 17, 18, right? That's going to be your 1 to 12, 1 to grade 12. And then, right, 18, 19 to somewhere between 22 and 23, but we're going to put it at 23. You're in, post-secondary. If you're going to university, which more people are, right? But even if you're not, right, it's likely you're going to do a 2-year certificate in something, or you're going to do some kind of trades or apprenticeship, right? So you're still looking at a period of education lasting well into your early 20s, right? So you're looking at, almost 20 years, 19-ish, 19 to 20 years of education. And as we'll talk about, it's becoming more normal now for people to do a master's degree, right? So we can now talk about, from like 22 to say like 24, maybe you're doing a master's. But we'll delve into that later, right? So basically the whole period, that you're a child and a teenager, you're in school, and a good, the first 2/5 of the emerging adult years are largely going to be occupied by school. So school is the primary thing that young people do, definitely until they finish high school, right? But increasingly, high school education just gets you economically nowhere, and people have responded with more school. I always think this is funny, and I don't know why. I guess like a couple weeks ago, I went to my 25th high school reunion, which kind of makes me weirdly nostalgic for this moment, I guess. And my daughter's 16, so she's coming up to this in not too long. We still treat graduating from high school as one of the big life transitions, right? To the point where we still hold a great big party about it. I think this is increasingly funny because, again, having a PhD makes you weird. But if I had known at 18 years old, what I know now, it would have been like, yay, I'm graduating from high school. Only, let's say 4, 6, 12 more years of school. No big deal, right? So you've done your 12 years. You're halfway there. Good times, right? But we treat graduating from high school still as this big kind of transition into adulthood. And it used to be, right? That's the interesting thing, right? If we go back even to the 50s, 60s, 70s, and even through a good chunk of the 80s, a good chunk of the population was never getting much education outside of high school. So that really was the end of education for them. But increasingly, right, in kind of later modernity or high modernity, that's simply not the case anymore, right? Okay, and of course, if you've taken SOC 100 or any other sociology class, right, you'll know school is one of those big sites of secondary socialization, right? So outside of the family, you're going to spend the most time of your young life where you're being formed in school, so your values and who you are in large measure is going to be shaped by your education system. So education systems are a very powerful tool of socialization, if you will. I was going to say indoctrination, but maybe both things are true. If I was an evil dictator and I wanted to indoctrinate people, the school system, excuse me, I was going to drop dead in the middle of the lecture. Cough into the microphone, you fool. If I was an evil dictator, the school system would be a good place to start indoctrinating people. And I mean, I think there, you can see that evil dictators frequently start by indoctrinating young people in school. Okay, so let's talk some nitty-gritty stuff in terms of secondary school and its impacts, right? So secondary school is obviously really important in the lives of young people, largely because it is, I just joked about how the transition from high school is sort of not that big of a deal because it's more school. Secondary school obviously is the platform on which post-secondary institutions base a lot of their decisions about admissions, right? So in terms of your grades, right, in Alberta, obviously it is, your provincial achievement tests, your PATs, that play a big role in, your grades and therefore what post-secondary institutions you can attend. In the US, right, they've got things like the SATs, right, the standardized achievement test, and based on your score on SATs, that can play a big role in where you get into college. But secondary school is still really important because it's that launching point, especially as people get more educated into that later education, and your performance in secondary school will, in large measure, determine some of your, not all of your life success, but a lot of your opportunities immediately after high school. Okay, now the history of this obviously is a little bit mixed, and especially, scores in kind of standardized testing are this really contested sort of battlefield culturally and between nations, right? And between provinces as well, especially since an organization called the OECD, the Organization for, or no, sorry, not the OECD, the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, started running an exam every couple of years called PISA, right? They started running this in the 1990s, basically to judge where different countries were in terms of their academic performance, right? And what came out from this is that in the 1990s, Canada and the US were really far behind other places, especially in Europe, but some places in Asia, in scores of reading, math, and science. Like they were down in the mid-20s, and that's kind of still where the United States is as a whole. They're still down, I think, about 26th, in and around there in terms of reading, math, and science scores, right? Now, what happened is when Canada saw this, or certain jurisdictions in Canada, mostly Alberta and Ontario, when they saw that Canada was scoring really poorly on PISA, they revamped their curriculums, and by 2010, Canada had jumped up these OECD ratings, right, or the PISA rankings, scoring second in reading, fifth in science, and sixth in math, largely driven by the super success of students in Alberta, right? The changes to the curriculum, especially in math in Alberta that happened in the 1990s, really drove success through the early 2000s. But Ontario then followed suit. Some places in Canada, like New Brunswick, Nova Scotia is kind of middle of the bag, but New Brunswick, PEI continue to be really laggards, right? I think students in New Brunswick score only about as well as students in Alabama. Trust me when I say you don't want to score as well as students in Alabama on anything. Not Alabama, not noted for its fantastic education system, really good football teams, really lousy mathletes. So I don't know if that matters, right? But Alberta and Ontario have largely pulled, Canada forward until recently when Canada started to slip backwards. And again, I don't know how aware you are of this. There was, for a few years, a program in Alberta, and it was in Ontario as well, called Discovery Math, which was this like more open way of teaching math, letting students find their own ways of solving math problems. And it absolutely tanked scores on standardized testing. So there was a big push probably about 10-ish years ago to get rid of Discovery Math because, we want to teach to the tests. Okay, the US has generally scored really poorly on international tests. Now, I will say this with a caveat. The US is a weird country. You may have noticed. I don't know. And here, it's weird, in terms of there are some places in the US that are quite rich. There are some places in the US that are quite poor. There are some places in the US that really emphasize things like athletics, and there are places that don't. And so when you take the US as a whole, it scores really, really badly. If you took different parts of the United States, that's a different story. So for example, if you took Massachusetts, right? So where the state in the northeast of the country where Boston is, Massachusetts would essentially score number one globally, right? You may have heard, there's a school just outside of Boston. You may have heard of it. It's called Harvard. Another one in Massachusetts, obviously the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, or MIT, right? So Massachusetts has put a lot of money into education, and globally Massachusetts would score number one. But then, take another M state. If you take Mississippi, Mississippi scores like 60th. Mississippi has a whole bunch of problems. They score really low. So, the US is weird. They've got your Mississippis, your Alabamas kind of dragging the whole country down, and your Massachusetts dragging it up. California used to score really well. California used to have a great school system. Now it is middle of the pack at best. So the US doesn't do super well. But weirdly, Texas has started to do better. So who knows? Okay. So the US consistently scores pretty badly in international testing, outside of certain jurisdictions. Canada's scores, after 2010 have sort of been slipping, right? So by 2022, Canada's scores had dropped out of the top 5 for pretty much everything, right? It was, 8th overall, 9th in math, 8th in reading, and 8th in science. Okay, and I mean, the perennial kind of super achievers in the PISA scores are places like Finland, although even Finland has slipped a bit, South Korea, and Singapore, right? They all score really, really well. Now, one thing that is worth noting is that countries that score really well, and this includes Canada, right? It includes Finland, South Korea, Singapore. The high score is basically driven largely by girls, right? And by the super academic success that girls have been having in the last few decades. We're going to talk about this more when we talk about, the crisis of boys and men. But if you take I'll give you a very quick little bit of statistics here. 66% roughly, right? Or 2/3 of the lowest grade earners, right? So if we, people scoring like a D are boys, right? And only about 1/3 are girls. So that's lowest grades. It's basically, I need to erase the SATs. When it comes to the highest grade, that's a highlighter. I have fat fingers apparently. So our highest grades, right? 33% of the people earning the highest grades in high school are male, and 66% are female, right? So girls are wildly outperforming boys on an educational basis. And I feel slightly bad about this because, I feel bad about this stat, obviously. But just yesterday, CBC did a big story coming out of Quebec about how this new government report in Quebec is like, oh no, boys are struggling academically. And I'm like, yeah, that's been true for 25 years. Thanks for finally showing up to the party, CBC. And they're like, we've known about this, but we didn't want to report on it because helping boys might undermine the success of girls. And I'm like, that is the stupidest reason for not helping boys I've ever heard. But whatever. It's like we should just let boys struggle and be miserable because, reasons. Anyway, I sometimes joke and that I will tell you tomorrow's news today. And in this case, I'm telling you today's news today. Because this just broke on CBC yesterday. And there's more of this coming, obviously, because the boys' academic performance and the struggles of boys' academic performance is a major story. that's been underreported for a really, really long time. Okay, no questions. Perfect. All right. Now, post-secondary education. So kind of a weird story with post-secondary education. What we've seen from a global perspective, right, is generally a big push for increased post-secondary education, right? Especially as you get, countries kind of moving into higher income brackets, right? There's been big pushes from the middle classes in those countries to get post-secondary education for their children, because the kind of late modern economy requires a post-secondary education to do really, really well, mostly university educations. Now, a lot of countries in kind of what you'd call the developing world, I like that term, I like the third world even less, but let's use developing world for the moment. Their university systems are a little bit underdeveloped, right? They don't tend to be as prestigious, and they don't tend to have enough spots to enroll all of the people that want to be enrolled. So what's happened is that there's been a big push to send people, what we call international students, to the West to attend universities, right? And obviously the big demand is for places like Harvard, Princeton, Yale. I would include the University of Toronto in that list, but no. No, I'm kidding. I have one friend. He's a great guy, but he did his PhD at the University of Toronto, and I swear every time we go for dinner, he manages to just mention, when I was doing my PhD at the University of Toronto, I'm like, yeah, Sean, I know where you went to school. We've been friends for like 10 years. I don't know why you feel the need to drop that in there every single time. It's a little funny. So, the Harvard of Canada feels its inferiority complex hard and fast, I guess. Right, we've had big pushes for those elite schools, but even less elite schools still see a big push for international students. Now, I will say, I said it's a little bit of a mixed picture. It's one of the things, and we'll talk about this in a couple of slides, one of the things that's also going to happen, and we're already kind of seeing this bubble, and we've seen this happen in Canada probably in the last 2 years to 18 months, is a lot of post-secondary institutions actually struggling to keep enrollments up and closing their doors. And this is true more of like small liberal arts colleges. This is almost, and we're seeing it in Canada now because Canada has cut back on the number of international students that they're allowing into the country. And what's going on here is that, it's all Gen Z's fault. No, I'm kidding. It's not that Gen Z isn't interested in education, is that Gen Z is a small cohort, right? In terms of the size of Gen Z as a birth cohort, they are much smaller than millennials. So what happened when, millennials are a pretty big cohort, largely not as big as the boomers, but they're largely the children of the boomers, right? Boomers were a big cohort, their children are going to be a big cohort. Gen Z is largely children of Gen X, and Gen X was a small generational cohort. So Gen Z is a small cohort, which just means less people needing that post-secondary education. So what we're starting to see is some slippage in enrollment numbers and fiercer competition amongst universities that invested a lot in opening more spots, your beloved University of Alberta among them, for those smaller cohorts of students, right? So we're going to see, I think, probably a lot of universities and colleges struggling with enrollment as Gen Z moves through. And then as Gen Alpha comes into the sample, Gen Alpha is also a pretty small cohort, right? So we're going to see, declining enrollments being, somewhat likely. So, I went into the right industry. Always choose a declining industry as your career. It's worked out well for auto workers. I'm sure it'll work out well for professors. Whatever, I have tenure, who cares? I'm basically impossible to dislodge. I'd have to murder someone. And even then, it's like 50-50. Like, was the person a university student? Just a random person? I think you're okay. You can keep your job. I'm only kidding a little bit. I've known of situations where grad students committed crimes, and the university's response to this is like, well, did they commit the crime on campus? It's like, technically, no. Oh, they're fine then. Like, just they're great. I'm like, okay, interesting. Like, as long as it's not an academic offense, apparently you can keep being a professor or grad student, no problem. Like I said, I have tenure, so who cares? All right, so we've seen this pressure, and there's been this big push to enhance or increase post-secondary slots, and now I think we're going to face a contracting pressure unless we manage to get more international students again. Okay. Along with this, right, and we're going to see this, and I'm sure you've lived through this in your young lives, governments increasingly have started to push for more vocational training, things like apprenticeships, but not just apprenticeships. Increasingly, governments really want to focus on post-secondary programs that have specific job outputs, right? So this will include things like plumbers, welders. Those are the two trades I can think of at the moment. I'm sure there's more. Carpenters, right? The things you would think of in the trades that you do apprenticeships for. But it would also include, what you might call white collar kind of vocational paths like nurses. Right, so if you go into nursing, right, you know that you're going to come out and look for a job as a nurse. If you go and do a Bachelor of Arts with a major in sociology and a minor in psychology, like all of you, or vice versa, it's basically 90% that, right? It's like, okay, I graduated and now I am a fry cook. No, I don't, obviously the BA doesn't, and this is the same for a BSc, you don't necessarily know what job you're coming out with. You go to nursing school, you become a nurse. Obviously, doctors, MDs, teachers, I can spell, even things like accountants. I have friends who are accountants. A job that combines my fear of numbers with my fear of tiny boxes. I can't imagine that being a fun job. Two things, don't want to deal with numbers, don't want to deal with tiny boxes. Right, but all of these things would be vocational paths, and government, does push, and you're seeing this in Alberta, right? Right now, there's a sort of labor shortage, especially in the trades. They push to get more people into those occupations, right? Okay, and the other thing, obviously, and we're going to see a big wave of this with AI, more people upgrading skills, right? Increasingly, what we're going to see, and is a lot of hype around AI. Maybe it's not all hype. I don't know. I remember a lot of this when the internet was new as well. It's like we need to retrain people on the internet, right? But as new technologies enter the marketplace, right, there's a lot of push to upgrade older workers to more relevant skills with part-time programs, or do job retraining of people who've lost their jobs because of technological shifts. So we'll see if AI does that. Okay, now along with that, and I'm sure you've noticed, right, education has gotten more expensive, and the cost goes up every single year, it seems like, right? So one of the things that a lot of sociologists will note with this is that the rising cost of education is leading to an increased class divide, right? Between the sort of education haves and the education have-nots. Those with post-secondary education tending to have a lot more opportunities in that sort of high modern job market that prizes post-secondary degrees. Okay, so, and obviously if you're middle class or rich, more likely that your parents are going to have been able to save or just be able to use disposable income to pay for you to go to a post-secondary institution, right? Yeah, those with higher income parents, no surprise, more likely to attend university. There's class sort of things going on here as well. Richer parents who are themselves educated at a post-secondary institution are likely to push their children to attend post-secondary education. Okay, as of, sorry, these are slightly older numbers, 2020, average debt load in Canada for someone completing a university degree was about $20,000. A lot of people, right, obviously, if they have wealthier parents, come out with no debt. And it's about $13,000 if you attended like a 2-year certificate or 2-year, it's not a degree, 2-year certificate, diploma, right, thank you. 2-year certificate or diploma program, right? The average there is about $13,000. The US obviously is a whole different ball game, and province to province in Canada, obviously there's a lot of variation. Like Quebec heavily subsidizes its post-secondary education system. Students pay very little in tuition, and obviously Ontario, Alberta, and British Columbia do not subsidize it as heavily, and it's much more expensive to go to school in those places. Nothing like the US though. If you ever, want to feel good about yourself, and you're like, wow, I'm getting off quite cheaply. Okay, so basically, this is per year tuition, right? At a community college in the US, and community colleges make up a weirdly big part of the US education system. They're often used as a stepping stone into a more prestigious post-secondary institution. They also have pretty low completion rates. I think it's like 30% of people who start a program at a community college actually finish, but they're relatively cheap, right? About $3,000 for annual tuition at a community college. If you go to a state college, right? So, you're a resident of Ohio and you go to the University of Ohio, or, North Carolina, you live in North Carolina, you go to UNC Chapel Hill, or North Carolina State University. I can't remember where state is. On average, you're paying, just north of $25,000, right? $26,800. If you go to a state college for a non-college resident, and this is the, Americans weirdly always want to live away from home to go to university. So a lot of them move states, right? You're talking about 43. A private non-profit college, right? So we're thinking here, something like University of Notre Dame, Baylor in Texas, Gonzaga in Seattle, right? I only know all the Catholic ones for some reason. I guess Baylor is technically Baptist, but I can only think of the Catholic ones. Right, you're talking about, imagine paying $55,000 a year for tuition. That would rack up pretty quickly. And an Ivy League school, right, and this is just for tuition. This doesn't include housing. Most people go to Ivy League schools, house there. Just the tuition at, say, a Harvard, Princeton, Yale, UPenn, Brown, Columbia, right, somewhere in the range of $65,000 a year. And with books and living expenses, even at a state college, right, you're looking at probably somewhere between $600,000, even up to $100,000 a year tuition in the US, right? So hopefully you're not paying $100,000 a year at U of A. If you are, I have a bridge in Alaska. I'd love to sell you for a very good price. I'm sure it'll be very profitable. All right, so obviously, both US and Canada, we're facing increasing debt loads for students, which means more young people starting out their working lives with large debt loads, right? And this has led to, and when we talk about, kind of that slow life pace, a lot of people have pointed to those large debt loads as a contributing factor, really kind of slowing people down and slowing their progression through the life course. So, a lot of them will start out their lives with pretty big debt loads, and that can put a kind of damper on things like marriage, family, property ownership, and all of that stuff, right? Now, I will say there's some contestation on this point because a lot of people have pointed out that somewhere around 60% of that debt, right, of the total student debt in the US is actually held by people who did MA degrees, right? Master's degrees, specifically in the humanities and social sciences, MAs or PhDs, right? So a lot of that debt is actually held not by kind of the general public, but by people who, go on for that 2 extra years or, a PhD. Let's say generously 8 extra years if you do the master's and PhD, and you do it relatively efficiently. Never believe, by the way, that you can do a PhD in 4 years. Completely unrealistic. It's a 5 to 6 year process for most people. Okay. So, I haven't seen if there's a... Oh, this is a good question. So, I will touch on this later in the course, but I will tell you this for the moment. We're having a really hard time figuring this one out as to why there's a difference in gender performance between boys and girls. Without spoiling my future unit, amongst the other things that are true is almost nothing that's been tried increases academic performance for boys, right? Now, mostly what we have are like programs that are gender neutral, right? Where it's like, is it Kalamazoo? I think the name of the place is Kalamazoo in Ohio. They have this crazy program where, because some rich benefactor anonymously donated a ton of money, anyone who goes to secondary school in Kalamazoo basically gets their college tuition paid for at any state post-secondary institution. And that program has allowed women from Kalamazoo to surge forward educationally, and it's done nothing for men, right? So even though they have like free college tuition anywhere in the state, they don't actually benefit from it. And all sorts of programs that have been aimed, at increasing post-secondary rates really help women, and they don't help men at all. So there seems to be, I don't want to say something broken in men. Maybe I just did. There's something that we don't, I'll put it this way. There's something happening with men that we really don't understand, right? And we can theorize, in some sense, that a lot of the social roles men used to occupy have disappeared. A lot of the jobs they used to kind of gravitate towards have also disappeared. And it's created a sort of motivational crisis in men and boys. We'll speculate some more on this after. Relatively, yes. As I said, Quebec is just finding this out now. Though if they'd talked to me, I could have told them that 6 days ago before CBC broke the story. It's pretty obvious. No one talked to me about it though, so that's okay. My email is open. It's pretty global. Yeah, at least in the developing world, and especially in places where largely heavy industry has been disrupted. Heavy industry tended to favor men really strongly. The service sector, we talked about this, when we talked about silence. The shift to an economy based on services has really helped women, and it seems to have been far less helpful for men. So this is pretty globally distributed, right? We see the same trends all across Europe, Canada, the US, and basically any developed country that isn't still largely engaged in manufacturing, right? Manufacturing changes things a little bit. If you have a really heavy industrial base that does manufacturing, so China wouldn't be affected in the same way. But yeah, it's pretty global. And again, we're seeing it all over, even in those, how should we say, redoubts of super educational performance like South Korea and Finland, right? We're seeing the same sort of trends. Girls surging ahead, boys falling behind. Japan too, right? So Japan definitely in that box as well. Okay, this causes all sorts of problems. All right, good questions. Hang on, I will clear them. But the honest to God answer, we really don't know. We're having a really hard time figuring this particular question out. Okay, I'll talk a little bit. I'll be very brief about this one. When it comes to debt, right? Picture is a little bit different in Canada than in the US. So Canada, sometime in the 1990s, they essentially privatized lending in the student loan system. And basically, along with that, they changed the law and made it so that student debt is only dischargeable in bankruptcy 7 years following the end of the last year in which the person went to any type of schooling, right? So from the time that you finish your degree until 7 years after, even if you go bankrupt, you're still going to be stuck with your student loans, right? And it's managed now by the 5 big banks, Royal Bank, TD, Scotia, Bank of Montreal, and CIBC. I got them all. Usually I forget CIBC. I can almost never remember CIBC. Meaning, right, if you're defaulting on your loan, they come after you with collection agencies and all of their fun tools. And obviously, this is a problem, right? Young people have less and less choice to pursue post-secondary education, but it's expensive and it puts them in a sort of debt trap at times. Now, this is, again, nothing compared to the US. The US, again, has done similar things, and largely because they wanted to increase college enrollments, they basically made a deal with lenders, right? Because, how to put this? Your degree is worthless except to you, right? Like, if you don't pay your student loans back, it's not like the bank can come and take your degree and sell it to someone else. Like, it's not like your car, right? So lending you money to do a degree is kind of a risk. Are you going to, do something really useful that's going to get you a great job and then you can pay back that loan? Or are you going to do a less useful degree and then struggle to pay back that loan and eventually, potentially default on it? Or struggle to pay it and take forever to actually pay off your student loans, right? And so a lot of financial institutions just didn't want to make student loans for this particular reason, right? Because it's not always a great bet. In certain disciplines it is, right? In engineering, you can almost guarantee that someone's going to pay back that loan. Medicine as well. Your double major in psychology and sociology, less so. And so basically what they said, they changed the law to make student loans non-dischargeable. So in the US, and again, be thankful you're Canadian here, US student loans are non-dischargeable, which means even if you go bankrupt 20 times, you still have to pay back that student loan. You cannot get rid of it by declaring bankruptcy. So fun times, right? Do you ever wonder why American graduates caterwaul, nice American word too, so strongly about their student loans? There's really no way out of them, right? You either pay them off or you die and hand them on to your children or your surviving relatives, right? They are non-dischargeable. They have to be paid back. Okay, the only way to die is to get rid of them is to die and have no heirs, right? And no one that can take on the loans. Your parents are dead, your brothers and sisters are dead, you have no children, and your cat Muffin can't take on a loan. So that's the only way to get out of your student loan in the US. Okay, very, very quickly here. This is just a chart from Twenge's book, Generations, comparing the increase in costs, average costs of education, compared to grants and loans. And you can see that average cost of education has really risen sharply starting right around 1980, right? It rises really quickly, and this is well above the rate of inflation. Okay. Speaking of inflation. All right, maybe I'll go for we'll go a couple more minutes and then we'll take a break. One of the big concerns around education today is around what's referred to as educational inflation. And here, right, so obviously inflation is an economics term, right? And basically what happens during inflation from a monetary perspective is, typically central banks will print more money, right? So they'll increase the money supply, which causes the supply of money to be worth less, right? So what happens when you increase the money supply, right? You get higher prices, right? Educational inflation is kind of similar, right? So if you increase the supply of bachelor's degrees or of any form of education, that form of education becomes less valuable, right? So as more people are educated, right, and we are shifting into a world where the majority of, say, millennials millennials and Gen Z are now holding some kind of post-secondary degree, the value of that degree is less, right? So, and I'm sorry to tell you this, I'm sure you know, but at this stage in your lives, right, I hate to be the bearer of bad news. I try to only microdose the depression. The value of a bachelor's degree is declining overall. And why? Because more people have them. Okay, so let's talk about the past, right? And not even that distant past, right? Let's say we talk about sort of the period from around 1960 to the end of the 1990s, right? Let's put it about 1999. Roughly speaking, right, through that middle part to the late part of the 20th century, what was considered the base credential, right? So, it used to be people would say, you can't drop out of school. What are you going to do with a high school diploma? Or what are you going to do without a high school diploma, right? Sorry, I'm thinking ahead of myself. What would you do without a high school diploma, right? The high school diploma was the base credential. If you did not have the high school diploma, it was going to be really, really hard for you to get a job, right? Because employers would look at it and they'd be like, you don't have your high school diploma, you're not worth hiring, right? Because employers always need to make quick decisions about whether you're a good hire or not. And a bachelor's degree, so for those people that had a bachelor's degree, and for each generation it's increased. If we go back to the boomers, it's somewhere maybe around 15 to 20%, right? That tended to get you a pretty high status, good paying, typically white collar job, right? And the high school diploma would get you into the economy, right, at the sort of base, and it would get you often good, reasonably well paying, blue collar, working class jobs, right? But it was a good kind of entry point. Now, things have shifted around a bit today. So obviously, and I tripped over my own tongue a second ago, I think the refrain now is, what are you going to do with a high school diploma, right? Because the truth is, employment rates, and we'll look at this when we look at work, employment rates for those with only a high school diploma are just above 50%, right? So if you just have a high school diploma, I think it's like 56% are employed, with the remaining 44%, outside of the labor market, right? Once you move into, bachelor's degrees, master's degrees, and above, then employment rates rise, as do wages, right? So the mid 20th century, right? High school diploma was your base credential. A BA got you a good job. A master's and a PhD, right? You were gravy. They were relatively rare. Today, if you notice a lot of people coming out of undergrad applying to grad school, the master's degree is probably what the bachelor's degree was about 20 years ago, right? It's going to get you into that relatively high status job, right? You're going to be in the upper tier. The PhD, right, is going to be, a step above that, right? It's a master's degree from 20 years ago. And now we have this whole other class. And it's kind of an informal one, but it's definitely there, right? Now, even if you do a PhD, and I'm really sorry to tell you this if you're thinking of going the academic path, increasingly to be in that top tier, right? You want to get that research job at a top tier university, in Canada, the US, or the UK, or Australia, you have to do at least one, but more frequently 2 postdoctoral fellowships, which will add something like 4 extra years to your education, right? Now, I did not go this path, because when I finished my PhD, people were like, you need to do a postdoctoral fellowship. And I was like, I was going to say something impolite. I said, I'm not particularly interested in doing that, though I may have said it using more colorful language. Right, because the idea, and I have friends who did go and do this, right? They went off from here, they went off to Halifax and did 2 years as a postdoctoral fellow, and then after that moved to Brown, in the U.S., Providence, Rhode Island, to do another 2-year postdoctoral fellowship before finally landing that tenure track job at Carleton University. Or I have a few friends who did this. One did, this doesn't sound so bad, they did their postdoctoral fellowship at Oriental University in Honolulu. Apparently Honolulu is really expensive though, but I'm like, oh, 2 years in Hawaii, poor you. It's minus 42 in Edmonton today. How are you doing? Right. So even at the top tier, right, we've had educational inflation. And the truth is, we're printing way more PhDs than we were 20 years ago, right? As from a few years ago, right, basically they said a few years ago, it was like there were 600 tenure track jobs available in Canada, right? Compared to 4,600 PhD graduates in that year, right? So we're printing a lot of PhDs, but there's not as many opportunities, right? So yeah, if you really want to be in that elite tier, you're going the postdoctoral fellowship route, which again, now think of it, you've done 24 years of schooling, add another 4 years. What's another 4 years, right? What's, a third of a century in school at the end of the day. Wow, when you say it there, it sounds really bad, right? So educational inflation is a big trend in education. And as we get more degree granting institutions, we get more degrees and they're worth less. Oh, have I depressed you enough? I think probably. I mean, I have all sorts of stories about this too, because I have more of an acquaintance than a friend, I would say. Interesting guy, tried to do his degree in economics and sort of flunked out, and just went to work, right? And basically he met his wife and he went to work for his wife's dad, right up until the day his wife's dad decided to retire and sell the company, and the new owner really didn't like him. So he took a payout package and went to find a new job. And what he found, even though he had something like 20 years of project management experience, he couldn't get a job anywhere, right? Because the first thing that everyone was looking for was a bachelor's degree, and he didn't have one because he hadn't finished his, he had not finished his university degree. He dropped out and went to work for his father-in-law. And so, eventually he ended up buying a company and creating himself his own job with money he borrowed from his father-in-law, which sounds like a deal with the devil to me. But whatever. Maybe they have a different relationship than I do with my in-laws. I don't know. Borrowing $500,000 from my in-laws sounds like it would not turn out well for me. But that is neither here nor there, right? That's how much we've seen educational inflation play, right? Without the bachelor's degree, it's that base credential. You can't even get into the market without it. Okay. Should we? Yeah, I'm going to say let's pause here because I'm almost out of tea. I need to refill my tea mug. Let's take a very quick pause. Let's say, again, 20 minutes. So come back at like 36. We'll continue on. We'll finish. We're almost done, I think, education. We'll keep going. Oh, that's an interesting question. I'll answer this question when we come back, and we'll keep rolling through this until we get to the end, and then we'll talk exam, and then we will be done. Okay, perfect. Okay, I guess it is that time. So let us continue. Okay, here's the question. If a master's is now highly desired by the workforce, will it become less competitive to enroll in? It's already done so, right? We're already seeing that happen. For example, like right now in sociology, we have a 1-year course-based master's of MA in sociology, right? And still good students enrolling in it, but the standards are lower. The other thing that's obviously going to happen, as there's more of them, they're going to become less valuable, right? Because employers will react to all of these things about the way that you would expect. Okay. Which is to value them less, right? If there's more of them around, they become less valuable. Okay. So, academic attainment and social class, no surprises here, right? Academic attainment, so how much school you end up going through, strongly tied to family background, right? And yeah, roughly every additional year of school parents have means a 5% greater likelihood of their children attending university, right? So the more educated your parents are, the better your odds are of attaining education. That's cumulative, right? So if two parents in a family both have just a bachelor's degree, that's a 40% greater likelihood, right, for a 4-year degree. If they have master's degrees, right, then you're talking about 60%, and so on and so forth. So, roughly speaking, okay. And the inverse is true as well, right? The less educated your parents are, the less likely you are to attend university. And this largely seems to be driven by values, right? The more educated, the more likely they are, to be thriving economically, and attribute that to having gone to a post-secondary institution and then pushing their kids to do the same. Okay. In all, in all sorts of ways, children from more educated and more affluent parents have a whole bunch of advantages, right? They will be the ones that have higher literacy rates, right? Largely because, two parents, more time to work with their kids, more time to read to their kids, and so their kids will tend to read more or have been read to more. So that in itself, is an advantage. And two-parent families, especially two-parent nuclear families, have huge advantages in this way, as we'll talk about when we talk about families. All right. Upper income parents also tend to be more engaged, right? Largely because they have the economic security and space to do so. They're less likely to be working long hours, less likely to be working 2 jobs or whatever, therefore more time to spend with their kids, more chance of things all the way from a lot of reading in the home, a lot of interaction, to driving their kids to all sorts of activities that are enriching. And they have more social capital, right? So they're better connected. They can use those connections to help their kids. And they're more likely to foster cultural capital in their kids, or helping them do things like learning how to navigate the adult world, right? How to interact with the adult world, how to advocate for themselves, these sorts of things. And yeah, they'll tend to, in that Rousseauian sense, cultivate their children, find their specific interests and foster those qualities in their kids. Okay. Along with educational inflation, one of the other big trends in education that's been coming really since Gen X is what's called credentialism. And that's the move, essentially from thinking of something, especially a post-secondary degree, something like a bachelor's degree or a master's, less as a sort of benefit to you, right? In the sense of you become a more well-rounded, holistic person, right? You learn the tradition of the culture you come out of, right? More to, it is just a piece of paper or a couple of letters that I'm going to get to put on my resume or CV that are going to get me that job, right? So increasingly, people don't think of, we used to talk about a liberal education as something that is enriching for the person. it is just part of, like, why do you go to university, right? For most people, the answer is, well, I want to go to university so I can get a job, right? So I can seek employment, and typically so that I can be well paid in that job, right? You want well-paying occupations rather than doing it. So what's this graph? This is percent of U.S. incoming college students who say they went to college to make money versus to gain a general education and appreciation of ideas. And you see that, right, sometime in the early 1980s, like about 1984, to earn money kind of, becomes more important than to learn about ideas, right? And this will have continued with that idea of a job being the main outcome of going to university, right? Not being cultured, not learning about ideas, about getting that job. And there's a way this was always the case. However, right, there was a different kind of cultural standard around this. So we've crossed over, into this, and what we've seen, from that is declines in things, especially the humanities, right? The humanities have really struggled because they're not inherently hireable, right? And I say this with love, right? And as someone with an English degree myself, my bachelor of arts was with a major in English, so I'm a humanities guy at my core, but it's a pretty rough credential, right? So it doesn't pay well. And as we've started to think of university more as a credential, students have really rationally reacted to this by moving into things like vocational paths, teaching, nursing, engineering, and away from kind of more generalist degrees that are more just about knowledge. Okay. Okay, so gender. Now that said, right, and we'll talk about this. Maybe I'll jump forward a couple of slides and I'll go back to talk about this one. I'll do things out of order. So generally speaking, when it comes to kind of women and men, well, one of the things that's happened is that women have started to, and actually have now for quite a while, been outpacing men across the board when it comes to academic achievement, right? So they earn more bachelor's degrees, more master's degrees than men. It depends on where you are, but it's roughly kind of a 60-40 split. If you look at all bachelor's degrees, about 60% of all bachelor's degrees go to women, with about 40% going to men. Now, and I mean, again, maybe I'll flick back here 2 slides. Where do they go? Where they go, and this is one of the kind of continual complaints of feminist scholars around this, is they tend into, what have stereotypically been female-dominated occupations, right? Teaching, nursing, social work, dominating the post-secondary fields that women go into, right? And things like, social sciences and humanities are roughly dominated by female graduates, right? So, earning a lot in there. Now, one of the things that, feminist scholars will tend to worry about is the fact that these occupations, right, teaching, nursing especially, tend to earn lower wages than a lot of the male-dominated occupations in the STEM fields. So there's long been a kind of push to get women to go into the STEM fields more, right? And feminists have been pretty consistent in suggesting that one of the reasons why STEM fields, why women are underrepresented in science, technology, engineering, and math, and overrepresented in teaching, nursing, social work, and things like administration, is largely down to socialization, right? That women are encouraged, really from birth to exhibit those traits that are sort of more normative in occupations like teaching and nursing, right? So care, They often call them the caring professions or pink collar jobs, specifically because, they tend to be more interpersonal and emotional. And feminists will argue that girls from a very young age are taught that these are, the traits that they should value. So they come to value them. Other kind of things is, until recently, right, and this is actually changing now, women have tended to put a higher focus on marriage and family life than men, and often will sort of choose occupations that are friendlier to those expectations. So, in the past, and we're seeing less of this, a woman might choose to go into nursing rather than into medicine because they assume that nursing would be more conducive to family life. Okay. And you can kind of see this on this chart, right? So while we have more women enrolling in undergraduate programs generally, and more women completing those programs, there are disparities, where they are, right? And yeah, a larger percentage of women in Canada hold undergrad degrees than men do. So if we look at STEM fields, right? So science, technology, engineering, and math. If we look at kind of the breakdown, way more men. So this is traditional STEM, right? So excluding healthcare. What you see, right? Roughly 30% of the graduates are women, or those enrolled in, rather than graduates, are women, right? Nearly 50% of them are men. It's the percentage. Traditional STEM plus healthcare, right? The gap closes a little bit, right? So when you include nursing and medicine, right, that gap closes a little bit. But when you look at, say, math-intensive STEM, right, very small number of women in those fields, right? Traditional, less math-intensive STEM, women actually are a little bit ahead there, right, just by a hair. Non-STEM healthcare, not sure what's in that category, to be honest. That's not nursing. So it must be things like radiologists and other, I'm trying to think what would be down in there. Maybe lower tiers of nursing, so less RNs and maybe LPNs. Not 100% sure what's in that category. Non-STEM business and related fields, right? Okay, so men are slightly more likely to go into business, but you see generally non-STEM, so your social sciences and humanities, right? It's kind of the inverse, almost the mirror image of the traditional STEM. Way more women engaged in those fields, or studying in those fields, than men are, right? So, all good. Okay, so obviously, from those charts, women continue to be underrepresented in our STEM fields, right? They still continue to choose, especially our traditional STEM fields. They still tend to dominate in, teaching, nursing, and social sciences and humanities. Now, that said, despite this, women are making really strong gains in a couple of what you might call high status occupations, right? I'll give you, I have a few here, but I'll give you another one that's interesting. Pharmacists, right, which is a very well-paying job. Pharmacists hit gender parity. Wow, a sneeze there, everywhere a sneeze. Pharmacists hit gender parity in 1986, right? So roughly 50% split of male to female in 1986. And, it's now skewed relatively towards women completing pharmacy degrees. I think it's about 60-40, right? So that's a very well-paying, high-status profession. Other high-status professions, women are making, some gains. So as of 2022, roughly half, right, just a hair short of half, of family medicine physicians in Canada are women, right? So, it's a roughly 50-50 split. Now, when it comes to specialists, right, so that's your kind of 7-year medical degree, right? You do your 3 years in school and then your 4 years of residency, and you end up, a GP or general practitioner. Sort of, I don't want to tier doctors, right? but it's as kind of your lowest tier of doctor in terms of status and earnings. And that's about 50-50 male to female. When you get into specialist physicians, right, that gets a little worse, although this has risen considerably from the 1980s where it was like 10%, right? It's now about 40% of specialist physicians in Canada are female. And yeah, as the boomer and kind of older Gen X physicians retire and you get more of the millennial, Gen Z probably not for a little bit, but millennial, I guess I know a few Gen Z doctors, millennial and Gen Z doctors, right? Chances are you're going to get a slight skew towards women dominating as all MDs in Canada, right? So somewhere, yeah, doctors under the age of 40, about half of them are women. So as, older doctors retire, that spread is going to get bigger. And I would expect that eventually to probably end up around 60% as well of doctors being women, though I would push that out to probably 2040 if I'm guessing. Okay. So yeah, by 2030, about half of all physicians in Canada will be women. And the law is similar, right? Another high status profession. By 2017, half of law school graduates were women, and they're about a little over half of enrolled law students today. Now, that said, they still tend to underperform their male peers, and gains have been relatively slow, right? In terms of law firm partners, only about a quarter of them today, or as of 2023, so 3 years ago, were women, and that number had risen, I think, a relatively anemic 7%, a little more than 7.5% since 2013. The big stress here for women when it comes to the law, and the thing that does tend to impede women's progression through the labor market typically is children and family. Sorry, was that a question or just fixing your hair? Okay, perfect. All good. Fixing your hair is dangerous. You might get asked if you have a question and then have to come up with one on the spot. Families, right? The law is a really weird profession, especially when you're like a young associate trying to work towards partner. You're often working, and I know friends who went into the law, 80 hours a week or more sometimes when you get out of school. And obviously that's not conducive. So when, you want to meet someone and you want to have children, a lot of women kind of fall off the partner track and will do things like starting their own small law firms or working much more constrained hours, but not being on that, track to become a partner in a law firm. Even then, right, women are making gains in high status professions. Okay. So, as I was saying a little bit ago, and this slide has been in my course for like 10 years. So again, I'm well ahead of the CBC. I don't know why that's important to me, but it is. I think I'm maybe a little salty about it because I'm like, anyone who was paying attention would have noticed this a long time ago. But the media. Boys are performing worse in school, right? And this has been the case for probably somewhere in the range of 25 to 30 years, 20 at the outside, or like at the minimum, right? And yeah, there's been this long-standing debate about whether boys are being left behind. And the truth is, despite, I would say, sporadic efforts to figure out this question, we don't have really good answers. People have proffered everything from, feminism, right, and shifts in, and a real focus on, improving girls' educational outcomes. Maybe that that was detrimental to boys in some way. They were left behind and no one was paying attention to their struggles. I think especially no one was paying attention to their struggles. There might be something there, though I wouldn't want to overstate it. Educational policies favoring girls or an educational system set up more for girls than boys. Again, I think that's a really pop culture easy critique to make. I don't think it's necessarily the full story. this is a really interesting book on that. This book is quite old now. I want to say it's like 2014, so, better than a decade old. This guy, again, kind of an interesting figure, Dr. Leonard Sachs, both a pediatrician and a PhD in psychology. And he wrote a couple of books. He wrote one, Girls on the Brink, Boys Adrift, and Why Gender Matters. And I think, where this book is interesting is what it blames for, and again, I think there's some truth to it. Boys' struggles are video games. And yeah, video games, and we'll talk about this later in the course again. Video games really prize agency, and agency is really important to boys, right? Sense of accomplishments. And the video game industry has gotten really, really good, with things like achievements and rankings at making boys strive in video games, and so spend a lot of time on it, right? Like if you've ever played something like Fortnite or Rocket League or any of these games, right? Moving up the tier rankings, in these games is a big deal to teenage boys. I know this is someone with a teenage boy, right? And where there's a lot of comparison and trash talk of their peers, like, oh man, you're only gold 3. Wow, you're terrible at this game of car soccer. What is wrong with you? I can't get out of gold ever because I can't put 70 hours a week into practicing this game. And there's like 8-year-olds that do. So what am I going to do? Teaching methods, right? This is an interesting one. And actually, this, I don't have time to go into it in great depth, but it's a really interesting debate whether the fact that most teachers are women maybe skews teaching methods in a way that doesn't appeal to boys. And Sachs has some really interesting arguments, especially around something like teaching reading and literature, where it might be more interesting to boys. That's in his other book, Why Gender Matters, but it's really interesting. And then, devaluation of masculinity. I guess Leonard was cool, and there before, figures like Andrew Tate and the Manosphere Bros got there. He's a little bit more modulated, obviously, because he's not an idiot. But things like prescription drugs too, especially ADHD drugs, Sachs is really critical of the overprescription of ADHD medication, and then environmental toxins. I can't remember that discussion. It's been a couple of years since I read the book, but again, really interesting kind of reasons. Now, that said, a lot of people are dismissive about this boys are doing bad argument, specifically because if you look in aggregate at, median wages, men still tend to outperform women economically, though this is for a relatively small segment of men, right? And it's an increasingly small segment. So if you look at like the top 10 to 15% of men in terms of earnings, they're going to widely outperform women, right? Because they're going to be in occupations, typically STEM fields or upper business administrations, right? So they're going to be more likely to be, C-suite executives, right? CEOs, CFOs, CTOs, and the like, right? Where they're going to be drawing in 6-7-figure salaries easily. Below that top 10%, though, male wages have largely stagnated since the 1970s, right, where women have surged ahead in the same period. So at the bottom tier of the labor market, men and women are much more equal. And in that mid-tier where most of the earners are, women tend to outperform men by growing margins, right? Okay. How many slides do I have left here? I want to make sure I have enough. I still have an hour, so oops, I didn't mean to start subtitles at this stage. Forget about that. Oh, why do I always look it up on my last slide? What's wrong with me? I feel like I'm getting towards the end. I should just put a little note in the corner that says last slide. All right, here we go. And again, we're going to talk about this a ton a little bit later in the course. It's a recurring theme. We're just going to introduce it here. College enrollment amongst young Americans in general is gradually declining, right? And like I said, this is driven in large part by Gen Z being a small cohort. There's just fewer people to go into the education market. And this is a problem that, again, is going to get worse, right? Because the tail end of Gen Z is even smaller, right? So as you get towards 2010, it's an even smaller birth cohort than it was at the beginning of Gen Z. So small cohort, Gen Alpha is a pretty small cohort as well. So this, college enrollment's declining is a trend that's going to continue. And it's not that young people are like, we don't need no education. We don't need no thought control. Hey, teacher, leave them kids alone. That's probably a reference for a way older crowd. It's just that the cohort is smaller, right? And this is going to continue. Largely, this has been sort of like patched over by international students. And as that's become less viable, we're going to see less of it. Now that said, okay, so yeah, in 2022, number of 18 to 24-year-olds enrolled in college was down by about 1.2 million from its peak in 2011, right? And we should note that you're probably looking at some of the last years of the millennials and the early years of that older cohort of Gen Z, right around there. Now, of that, though, about 1 million, so 1.2 million, there were 1 million fewer men enrolled in college compared to only 200,000 fewer women enrolled, right? And yeah, young men make up now only about 44% of total young college students today, down from 47% in 2011, right? So at that peak of college enrollments, it was slightly skewed male to female, and today that skew is getting bigger over time. Okay, and we're going to talk about that again later on. Cool. No questions. All right, so maybe I'll discard my scribbles. Otherwise, I just have to put them in. So that is the end of content for midterm number 1, right? And that, I think, leaves us at a good place. I'm glad I didn't try to fit families in there because that would have gone bad. Okay. Open. Now, you can see I've put all of my energy into design for this slide. It's like, wow, you care so deeply about design for your slides. Here. White text, or black text on white background. Woohoo, I know, isn't it amazing? All right, so it's the same Slido if you want to ask questions about these practice questions. Okay. Oh, there was one thing I wanted to change with these and I forgot. I'll put it this way, and I'll tell you as I go kind of what the breakdown is. So let me get my highlighter out. So this is a question, right? And I'll go through a few different styles of question, or questions from a few different units. My questions tend to be pretty straightforward, right? There's not a lot of deep, dark trickery in these questions. It's really all about the details that you want to put in, right? Now, most of them are either 2 or 3 part questions. So I'm going to give you some general tips, right? And then we can go into the specifics. General tips as to what works, because people always have this question. So I'm going to start with general tips, and then I'm going to kind of look at how to answer the question. Okay. So this is obviously a 2-part question, right? And the way the breakdown is, though I don't have it written here, and I will have it written on the exam, is the breakdown for yellow, right? It's going to be 5 marks, and for blue, it's going to be 5 marks as well. Right, so roughly speaking, 50-50 on this question. Some of the other questions might have 3 parts, and the breakdown is going to be a little bit different. Now, because it has 5 marks, that doesn't mean you have to put 5 points, right? It's just a 10-point question with marks given 50-50 on each part of this question. So just write until you think you've answered the question. And I did answer this at the beginning of the course. But roughly speaking, your typical good answer is going to be between 250 and 350 words, right? And again, that's not a hard and fast. I don't have a word minimum or a word maximum. I've had people write me 200 words and do perfectly fine. I've had people write me 1,600 words and I want to hurt myself, on every question on an exam, because man, it takes you a little bit. Now this one, 60, I think 2 people have dropped. So there's 58 of you in the spring term. I could manage 58 exams pretty easily. When I have 150 students in the fall and winter, long answers hurt a little bit. They hit a little different and they hurt a little more, which maybe is the point if someone wants to hurt me. I'm so charming. I don't know why they would. Okay. Here's just a general sort of tip, and this will tend to, make it a lot easier on me, and I'm all about making stuff easier on me. But it'll also, I think, make it easier on you to make sure you've answered both parts of the question. I would say if you're writing, rather than the wall of text, right? So I'm going to pretend this is a text, right? And you've got the wall of text, no spacing. Good way to answer these questions in kind of general terms is, okay, you've got the first part of the question, put a dot or a 1 and answer that part of the question, and then put a 2 and a dot or whatever you want and answer the second part of the question. Break it up, put a space between them. Visually, it's a lot easier for me to find where you're answering parts of the question, and it's going to help you organize your thoughts a lot better. Plus, if you have a chance to review before you hit the submit button, right, you can easily read this first part. According to Postman, what role did the invention of the printing press in 1440, that should be play in the development of our modern understanding of childhood and youth, right? Okay, did I answer that question, right? Easy. And then the second part of the question briefly described the historical process that led to our modern idea of childhood and youth, right? So, split it up. It'll be much clearer for me to listen to that answer or to read that answer at the end of the day, and I think you'll have a clear sense in your mind of what to do, right? And again, there's no need to balance the parts. Both parts don't have to be one as long as the other. Okay, does that all make sense? Perfect. Sorry, I have to check because some people aren't here. All right, I'm now going to erase my general tips. Again, so how do you answer this question? So let's put it part 1. So this is just like a pretty straight conceptual answer. So what role does Postman think the invention of the printing press play in the development of our modern idea of childhood? So it's easy, right? Easily you can just say, right, so it's central to it. Often these questions are old questions I've taken out of the exam, and I usually edit them. So it's central, and I would almost always now add a Y, because otherwise people will give me one word. But let's say I had added the Y in this question. So it's central and why. Okay, so it changes the social environment. And you can put social, and here even an economic environment. And you can put here a bunch of things, right? I won't write in complete sentences, but you want to support this with some stuff from the course, right? So he talks about, it splits adults from kids, right? Specifically, adult knowledge. I'm just going to put grows exponentially, right? So adults have way more knowledge. Kids, right? They have to be taught to read. So they can't understand print, right? So they have to be taught, which means you need a place and a time for them to learn. And so, school, so that means we create, schools existed, but we increase the number of schools. And increase the time, right? Where kids are are out of the economy. And you can throw in all sorts of fun things here, right? You can talk about, the proliferation of schools, right? It goes from like 44 schools in England in 1460. And then by, I want to say 1640, I can't remember the exact, or 1680, it's 444, one every 12 miles, right? So it fundamentally changes things. Kids start to spend longer in school, right? More of their youth time is dedicated to learning. The economy starts to move forward, and you need literate people to be able to work in that economy, so all of this proliferates. Okay, so that's part one, right? Why does he think it's central? Mostly because it creates that split, and it forces adults to kind of put kids out of the economic life so that they can learn those skills to function in a print economy. Okay, now I wrote in really big letters and I have no space left on the slide for part two. I might have to erase. All right, so briefly describe the historical process. And here, maybe I won't go into kind of such detail as I just did in part one, but if you get something like this, right, the historical process, you want to kind of trace out, the history that, we traced out in that first part of the course, right? And here, you could start at, say, 1440, right? And you have an oral culture in 1440, and then you get the invention of the printing press, right? And then you kind of want to probably describe a couple of landmarks along the road here, right? In this 500-year process until we get to about 1850 to 1900, right? So you can do things like you can talk about, bless you, the schools, right? Increase in the number of schools. You can talk about, that slow growth of this idea of childhood as a time of innocence. It starts in the middle class and upper class, and then it will kind of trickle down eventually to poorer classes, right? To the working class and the poor. Eventually you start to develop different language, right? So I can't remember the year now. I think it's prior to 1600, you get the idea of pediatrics. 1744, you get the publication of the first book for children, right? Jack and the story of Jack and the Giant Killer, right? So give a couple of kind of markers along this line, and you can say that by the 1850s, you have things like the child saving movement in England, America, and Canada that's upper class people focused on bringing childhood, in a sense, down to those working class kids. But it's this long kind of process that develops, right? So give me a couple, if you get this kind of a question, give me a couple of road markers along this 500-year journey. Does that make sense? Okay. Again, the test is open book, so you have your notes, you have the slides, whatever you want, you can use anything there. Okay, no online questions. Okay, this is I think a pretty easy one. Did I skip some? No, I didn't. Okay, I feel like they're out of order. So this is, this is right out of the slides. And again, this I think is a slightly too easy question, which is why I took it out. Probably because everybody was getting 10 out of 10 on it. And we can't have that. Someone needs to get 3 out of 10. So we must go with slightly more awkwardly worded questions. So, what technology or technologies were most critical to the changing social roles of women in the 1960s and 70s, right? Okay, so there's obviously, here the trick is, like when I had this question, what was the trick? If people put television, right? All right, I'll just put TV. That was a mark down, right? Because the question is specifically about women, right? So what technologies are central for women? Television was central kind of generally, right? Or more globally, but we had two classes of technologies here. So this would be like, if someone had answered TV, that was a -2 when I had this question. Because the question, right, was about women. But obviously the technologies are birth control, right? Because we're talking about the boomers. And our labor-saving devices. So, right, so you can name those technologies and then give a why for each of them, right? So birth control. Obviously, right, that one is pretty simple. right? It separates, say it controls fertility. We see a decline in the number of children per woman. That's why Gen X is such a small cohort, right? So we see a decline in the number of children per woman. So it allows them to control fertility, separates, sex and conception. So women, can experiment sexually a lot more. It shortens the time that most women are having children, meaning they can re-enter the workforce in, quicker, more, intentional ways rather than, waiting probably well into their late 40s before they re-enter the workforce, right? So it changes it in that way, right? So birth control is the easy one. I think actually labor-saving devices is pretty easy too. Labor-saving devices, right? So you got your dishwasher, what was a B? Dishwasher, and washing machine, and you can include the microwave and the vacuum as well, right? And here you just want to give either kind of a general reason, or you can break it down by technology. All of them basically made the work of social reproduction, right? So taking care of a family, getting them clothed and fed, all of those things that women used to spend a lot of their time doing, and automated that time, right? So it's basically a form of home automation that allows, women more time to be in the labor force, right? Spend less time in the domestic sphere, and all of that energy that used to be on social reproduction can then be put outside of the home, right? So largely into the working world. Okay, does that make sense? Okay. I got excited. I thought you had a question, but you two were just fixing your hair. Just to clarify, the entire answer with all the parts should total around, 250 to 350 words, roughly speaking. Again, don't freak out if it's a little bit shorter or even a little bit longer than that, right? If you're at 375 words, don't spend your time editing 25 words off your answer. It's 5 questions in 90 minutes is a pretty quick turnaround. So I would say don't obsess around that word count. Be in that ballpark. What should you focus on more when studying slides/lectures or readings? I tend to put it more on the slides and lectures together. The readings I always think of as supplemental. There's lots of good stuff in the readings, and I'm always impressed when people quote something out of the readings in their answers. It's always really nice. But I'm sort of not expecting it, especially in spring when the turnaround is so quick, right? So I would say focus more on the slides and readings. Okay. But yeah, on length, if you're 25 words short or if you're 25 words over, don't flip out about that. Yeah, please.
How much is grammar?
Absolutely zero. As long as I can understand what you've written, and sometimes it goes slightly hilarious, but as long as I can figure it out, and I'm pretty good at it, don't worry about the finer points of grammar. This is more of a rush than anything else, right? So I would say don't concern yourself. I've been very forgiving of even hilarious grammatical errors that change the meaning, even wrong words. I'm like, I think that word is this, so I'm pretty forgiving on this. Unless I need to bring the average down, and then, no, I'm kidding. I've never had to. Okay. Sorry, does that make sense? Is that kind of good? Does looking at more questions help? Do you want to see a couple more before I let you go? A couple more? Okay. How many more? I think I just have 3 more. Oh, this is the same question, roughly. Okay, so I have 2 more. So we'll do these 2. So, define the term emerging adult. Now again, this one is maybe I don't want to say it's challenging, it shouldn't be. I don't have a definition of emerging adult in the slides, right? So I don't think this is too hard. But we talked about it a lot, right? So emerging adults are young people, roughly 18 to 29. And if you want to be a little bit more specific than that, so they're usually, young people who have not hit the markers of adulthood. And what are those markers? Right, so it would be career, family, house, home ownership. I'm trying to think of, those are the big ones, right? So career, I guess marriage. I put family, and I'm being too broad there. Marriage especially, right? So, and we're typically talking, they're adults, but they haven't quite become full adults, right? So that would be good. A definition like this would be good for your full 3 marks. Okay, when did the concept emerge? And I don't know if I talked about this. Again, this is an older question it's not in there anymore. But roughly speaking, right, so time period or generational cohort, when did we start talking about emerging adults? And here, either Gen X or millennials would be a good answer, or the 1990s / early 2000s, right? So again, that's only for 2 marks. So, no, you don't have to be super detailed there, right? If it's only worth 2 marks, you can be pretty brief in your answer. Now, the big one, right, using material from any part of the course so far suggests 2 reasons this category has become necessary for sociologists. And there's lots here that you could do, right? You probably here would be looking at some of the material from the generations unit. So you could have, right, well, let's say you wanted to talk about Gen X, right? So Gen X, right, the kind of sexual norms shift around, right? You get this change in the way families get structured and when people hit those things, right? We see our age at first marriage getting later, right? People spending more time in school, right, from our education unit. So they're hitting, more debt. So they're having trouble launching into some of those adult responsibilities. Less like, with the millennials, less likely to settle down. Those serious relationships are for later. Kids are for later. Those years when you're in university and just after are that time where you're discovering yourself, right? Any and all of these things, perfectly good. And just pick 2 of them. 2 reasons that this has become necessary, right? They're growing up slower. It's taking longer to hit those milestones. Things that used to happen in the early 20s, like marriage and kids, are happening much later with Gen X and millennials, right? Does that make sense? Okay, and like I said, just pick and kind of explain 2 reasons. So hopefully you're seeing my questions are not crazy pants. Would answering the 5 W's be a good strategy? Just like who, what, when, where, why? Is that what you mean by the 5 W's? I guess it depends on the question. If I'm understanding your question correctly, is that what's meant by the 5 W's? Okay, I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I don't think it would work for every single question. It might work for this one, right? Like, when did this, who was it that this had to, where, when, why? Yeah, would be okay. And how, which has a W at the end. For some questions, yes. For other questions, okay. Thank you. That took so long. No, I'm kidding. I was just floundering about there. I would say sometimes, but not always, right? So I wouldn't recommend it as a universal strategy for all of the questions, because there's going to be questions that simply doesn't fit. But if you think it fits, right, if like for a question like that, then absolutely go ahead and use that kind of structure. I never want to prescribe a structure too much, just because then people get really locked into, I have to answer the who, what, when, where, why, and they're like, I can't figure out the how, right, or the who. And then people will get freaked out and they'll spend like 20 minutes working on that one piece of the question. But I don't need that that construct. But if it works for you, absolutely do. Is young adulthood synonymous with emerging adulthood? I would say yes and no. I think young adulthood is a somewhat more ambiguous term, and emerging adulthood is a much more, as a sociological one, where it's like, yes, like legally an adult, but typically haven't hit those markers of adulthood, right? Specifically around, career, marriage, children, home ownership, right? Whereas young adulthood, I've seen used in a much more ambiguous way. So it's somewhat similar, but it's not an exact overlap. And again, when we talk about emerging adulthood, most people put it in this very specific age category, whereas young adulthood is a bit less specific in my mind. Okay. That's all. Okay. Does that last one make sense? All right. And I think, this is my last one because my other one's a repeat. And then I'll let you go a little early, which don't cry. I kid. All right. So, how does Smith believe moral reasoning amongst millennials differs from moral reasoning among other generations? Okay. So this is what I talked about last class on the beginning of this one, right? So Smith and Patricia Snell, I shouldn't leave Snell out, but I did, is millennials, right? Oops, that's two. Millennials, I always want to spell millennial with one N, are moral consequentialists, right? And you probably want to explain this a little bit. What is a moral consequentialist, right? So the morality of any given act is related to its results, right? So rather than an act being either moral or immoral in general, is it right or wrong to steal? Well, if the place that you're stealing from has insurance and they're going to be made whole, well, it might not be wrong to steal, right? Because you're not really hurting anyone. You're benefiting yourself. You're not actually hurting that store because they have insurance that's going to pay for it, right? Or if you were going to cheat on a test, right? Well, it might not be wrong inherently because you get ahead and it doesn't hurt anyone else, right? Your peers aren't hurt by your cheating, right? It's just you that benefits. So cheating might not be wrong, right? So everything comes down to the morality. And like Smith talks about, right? Millennial morality is largely down to a philosophy of harm. Does it hurt anyone else, right? And again, this is somewhat different from the moral reasoning of older generational cohorts, especially that were more likely to have, let's say, a more objective kind of sense of morality. Things were either right or wrong, and there were sort of reasons for that. It wasn't down to its consequences as much. Okay, so that's your moral consequentialist, right, for 5 marks. For the second part of the question, what key philosophical trends have contributed to this type of moral reasoning, right? So there's obviously a couple you could point to. The big one, and I put big shiny arrows, when I was on the slide, postmodernism. And again, I would probably have a why attached to this question. Postmodernism, you could also put subjectivity. Postmodern subjectivity. Oh, there's one more. I just can't remember off the top of my head. It'll come to me. Right, so postmodernism obviously is this, philosophy that there are no sort of objective standards. We get this from, Derrida, Foucault, and the like, right? So they're deeply postmodernist in that they don't really believe that there is anything objective. Everything is down to, and these kind of go together, right? People's subjective self-perception, right? Oh, social constructionism, right? That would be the other one. See, I told you it would come to me. Right, so here you would think like rules, regulations, morality are all essentially social constructs. There's nothing objective behind them. The thing that would link all of these, right, is lack of objectivity or lack of a objective moral norms. And millennial kind of discourse is all about feelings. It's all about subjective, right? It's right for me, but it might not be right for you. That might be true for me, but I don't know if it's true for everybody else, right? So in lacking objective moral norms, they fall back on a fairly, consequentialist morality, just looking at, well, is anybody getting hurt at the end of the day, right? Okay, so postmodernism, subjectivity, and social construction all lead to that lack of objectivity. If you want bonus marks, right, you can all, well, there are no bonus marks, but if you want to impress me, just note that I said always really interesting because these are all kind of deeply academic ideas. They come from people like Foucault, from Derrida, from Lyotard, Baudrillard, and Peter Berger, despite the fact that millennials have never read any of these for the most part. The ideas of these kind of philosophical movements have deeply imbued the millennial consciousness, right? So you can throw that in there for funsies if you get a question like this. Okay, any questions? Do these questions frighten you? Yeah, go ahead.
So, I think it was just a little bit, but where do millennials get a lot of that postmodern thought? Is it like the media they consume, how they're parented?
So I used a very non-academic word. It's a little bit in the parenting, and here let me clear off some space to write. The zeitgeist, right? It just seems to be like it permeates the social environment, right? It's everywhere from the media to the parenting to the values of their peers, right? It just kind of, for whatever reason with millennials, infused everything. I gotta be careful what I say here. It probably starts in the academy and then sort of like slowly works its way down into the culture, right? And that often happens, right? Really high, like you saw these kinds of ideas in the academy in the 60s and 70s. By the 90s, it was, kind of everywhere and it was sort of widely accepted. I don't think anyone really knows why, and it's not, I think, because anyone made the choice like this is what morals are going to be like right now. It just sort of took over the culture, right, in the way ideas sometimes do. So I'm sure that's a very satisfying answer, because there's no direct process of like, well, university professors started to teach their students, and those were the baby boomers, and the baby boomers, passed that on to their kids. It's never that direct a process. It's just this kind of cultural diffusion of, shall we say, elite ideas over time, right? And yeah, media, peers, parents probably play a role. Please. Any what?
Charts, graphs.
Were you in my SOC of religion class? Did I hurt you with the graphs? There are no graph questions. Sorry, I have on my final exam in SOC of religion, I have a question that's just about explain this chart. And tell me why it's important and what theory. I may have caused a little bit of trauma to that cohort of students because they were all very fearful, but you all did fine. The grades were fine. But I freaked people out when I started talking about charts. No, and honestly, like I don't have a whole unit in this class, which is basically just like a wall of chart after chart. I only do that in SOC of religion for personal reasons. Because I actually don't have a better way to explain all of the data and how little sense it makes. But no, there's no explain this chart, I promise. You're very welcome. Or maybe, no, I'm kidding. I won't do that. Other questions? Well, I'll stick around until people are gone, so if you want to ask questions, I will be here, or you can send me an email. Just before I let you go, I do want to just remind you of how it's going to work. So on Wednesday of next week, I will start class at the normal time, 1 o'clock, but the exam is open from, you absolutely can reference charts in your answer. Great way to go about it. If you get a question about like gender and education, right? And you want to reference that chart that shows, the overwhelming number of men in traditional STEM fields versus the overwhelming number of women in non-STEM fields, great. Absolutely, you can do that. You can be like, hey, there's this chart on slide of this lecture, and then it's perfectly all right to do, and very good, actually. Bring in data, bring in points from the slides. That's going to improve your grade in general. Okay, right, I was talking. The test is open from midnight to midnight, basically, on that day. You do it on Canvas. Accommodations will be added for those with accommodations. If you want to email me questions, I'm most available through most of the morning, so you might want to do your exam then. The afternoon gets a little bit more chopped up. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I need to tell you. I think that's everything. Is point form okay? Yes, but don't be too brief, because sometimes point form, people will put like not enough information to get you all the grades, and that always sucks. But I kind of love point form. It's way easier to mark. Like the wall of text is a nightmare. The point form is a less bad nightmare. Okay, I think that's it. Go in peace. Have a good long weekend, because there's no life on Monday, at least for me. All right, we'll see you on Wednesday. You as well. Didn't even end that early. Hi.
I was the one that asked about like the difference between boys and girls with
Okay.
education. And now I'm just wondering, like,